Okay, so it's a pleasure to be in Moscow. So I will present some of the work which I've done together with Eva Chade, who is working in the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, and Gerson Ford, who was previously a PhD student of mine long time ago, and who is now a director of research in CNRS in Toulouse. And it's about stochastic proximal gradient algorithms. So how long do you have? It's 40 minutes or?
Usually an hour.
An hour, it's okay. Okay. So I'm not sure that it will be 1 hour, but okay. So this is the outline of my talk. So I will start by trying to describe the general context. So it's more about models. So just to give you a feeling of the type of problem we are interested in. Then I will describe things which are, I think for some of you, perhaps you know it. So it's about proximal gradient algorithm. It's a special instance of an algorithm which has been invented by Nemirovsky in the 90s. Then I will discuss perturbed proximal gradient algorithms. Then I will do Monte Carlo proximal gradient. And then I will go back to my first themes, and I will just present the type of results we have obtained, and then I will conclude. Okay, so I will start very slowly, and I will just because I don't know your background, so this is why I will spend some time on the model itself, and then I will show you what type of problems we are trying to answer. So the type of problem we are looking at are problem where you try to predict binary response. So associated to this binary response yi, you have covariates. So covariates are denoted by xi. So it's a bold x is a vector. So typically it would be vector, and you have p covariates. And so So of course, what are the binary response? It can be it's general. The general problem is called binary classification problem. So. Do you have, so it can be a yes and no, or can you predict if you like or you don't like something, or are you susceptible to develop some type of cancer, or you're not susceptible, and so on. So there are many examples where you try to predict the outcome, a binary outcome, which is random, but this binary outcome is more or less, might be explained, and we try to model how this binary outcome is explained by explanatory variables which are called covariates. And you are trying to do something which is a little bit more than simply predicting the class. So it's not only a classification problem. What you are willing to do also is to try to estimate the probability. So your goal, your ultimate goal, is not to have a correct classification, which is typically what you want to do when you have a binary classification problem, but you are willing to predict a probability of a class. And of course, the most classical model to do this is to assume a kind of parametric model. So of course, you can do much better than that. But one very popular parametric model is to assume that the YR are Bernoulli random variable, and that conditional to the explanatory variable xi, the probability of success is a certain function phi of a linear combination of the explanatory variable. Okay, it's a very simple model, and I make it even more simple because I'm assuming that the function phi is known. So what are the constraints for to be a good function phi? So the constraint to be a good function phi is to be a function taking value between 0 and 1, because you are trying to model a probability. So it's called the link function. There are other link functions, but I will use this link function. So which means that the flavor of what is logistic regression. So the flavor of logistic regression is the following. What is your parametric model? Is that you assume that the probability of a success, so the probability that yy is equal to 1, conditional to xi, where xi are your vector of explanatory variable, is this function, which is called a logistic function, or is also called a sigmoid function, of a linear combination of the xi. Okay, that's your model, and this defines one of the most popular, I would say, and most elementary algorithm in machine learning, which is called the logistic regression problem. there is a way to interpret this, which there is a mistake there. It's a probability of y equal to 0. So the one way to interpret this stuff is to assume that what is called the odd ratio, so the logarithm of the odd ratio, so which is what is the odd ratio is the probability of having a success divided by the probability of having a failure. So which is p of y equal 1 given x divided by the probability of y equal 0 given x, which is the odd ratio. So the logarithm of the odd ratio is a linear combination of explanatory variables. So it's a kind of, if you want to interpret this, it's a kind of what you are doing when you are performing logistic regression. You are performing a kind of linear regression, but you are not doing a linear regression on the observation themselves, but you are doing a linear regression on the logarithm of the odd ratios.
Maybe it should be 0, y equals
0. Yeah, otherwise it would not be very interesting. It says 0. So 1 is 0 there, okay? Okay, and it looks at the end of the day, it will look a bit like this. What you will do is that you will try to fit, in fact, the parameter beta in order. So here it's easy. So you try to fit the parameter beta in order to more or less classify the probability correctly. So what we do here in what I am interested in is so in fact there are a lot of assumptions in when you do a logistic regression. And sometimes these assumptions are not realistic, so I will not spend too much time on the modeling problem, but I will present the problem. It's just a motivation for what of the algorithm I will discuss later on. So it's a problem where instead of looking at a classical logistic regression, you look at a logistic regression with something which is called mixed effect. So what is a mixed effect? So it's typically it looks like a logistic regression, but you add a vector. So you add a vector u. So u is a vector, and u is a vector which is not observed. So it's a vector of latent. It's a vector of latent variables, so which are random. And what you assume basically is that given yi, and of course the explanatory variable xi, the observation yi are independent Bernoulli random variable, but this time the probability of success is a function both on which depends on the explanatory variable, so linear combination of the explanatory variable, plus of course the random vector u, okay, which is filtered by something which is called the factor loading matrix. So I will not explain exactly how you construct a factor loading matrix. There is an estimation problem also for factor loadings, but factor loadings, we typically what we do is that we add to the eta I theta, so the classical logistic regression terms, we add a random effect, and this random effect is structured by this loading matrix. Okay, so you add a latent random variable u, which is not observed, and doing this, your observation becomes in fact conditional to u. It's a logistic regression, but in fact u is not observed, so you will have to, when you do inference, you will have to marginalize with respect to this random effect. Is okay? So it falls in the general framework of linear models with random effects, and it's very useful in many instances. What is the main motivation? And we will not spend much time to discuss the motivation, but what is the main motivation? The main motivation here is to add. Okay, thanks. The main motivation here is to add a kind. You think, in fact, the motivation is that you say, okay, I observe the x1, I observe xn, so I observe explanatory variable, but perhaps there are other explanatory variables which have not been observed. All the explanatory variables which have not been observed are put in this latent variable u. Okay, and of course, if you are construct these things, then you obtain models where you have this type of factor loading. So I will explain what the meaning of factor loading there, but that's the model I'm testing. Okay, so the inference of this model is not so easy. So what you will typically do to infer this type of model, so because it's at the end of the day, it's a parametric model, so it can be in large dimension because I've not mentioned, but in typical application we have in mind P is very large, so P can be of order of 1,000 or 10,000. So I have examples, I've run example where P is very, very large, but typically what we do is that to do parametric inference, what we do, we use a likelihood, and to obtain the likelihoods, it's the log likelihood which is written here. So L of theta is a log likelihood. So what is a log likelihood? So given the observation, so given the binary response and the covariance xi, you compute the likelihood function. So the likelihood function conditioned to the random effect is given by this. So it's simply the likelihood of a Bernoulli random variable. So given you the variable yi can take two values, which is 0 or 1, and the probability of success of the Bernoulli random variable is the function phi applied to the log of ratio, which is eta I theta u. Okay, so this is the likelihood of the conditional to u. This is the likelihood of a Bernoulli random variable, and because you don't observe the random effect, what you do is that you have to marginalize with respect to the random effect. So which means that at the end of the day, what you have to, if you would perform a maximum likelihood, you would have to maximize this likelihood function, which is the conditional likelihood, which is sometimes called the complete likelihood. So it's a likelihood where you add the random effect and you marginalize the complete likelihood with respect to the random effect. And here the random effect is assumed to be distributed according to a Gaussian random vector with in dimension q and with an identity covariance matrix. And so which means that you have to integrate the complete, to obtain the log likelihood, you have to integrate the complete data likelihood function with respect to the density of the random effect. Okay?
We assume to know the dimension q and the variance.
Yeah, that's for sure. So there are many things which of course, q is assumed to be fixed. You assume to know the loading factors. So there are many things that you can discuss. It's a rather classical model, but of course there are many other problems. Like for example, the dimension of factor loading is an interesting issue also. So because the dimension of the parameter is quite large, what I will do also is that I will use a penalized likelihood estimator. So I will not discuss penalization here, but it's a good. So I will regularize the maximum likelihood problem with a penalty. So it's a very classical way to when you do machine learning. It's a very classical technique in high-dimensional statistics. And the penalty I will use here, it's a very classical one. It's a penalty which combines the square. It's a beta to the square, so it's called the so it's the two norm and the one norm. So the one norm promotes the sparsity. Okay. It's called the lasso, so you have learned of lasso already, so it's a lasso type penalty. And the other penalty promotes the type of smoothness, so it's of the regressors. Okay, so basically this is a problem. So what I try to minimize, so I do, it's not maximum likelihood, it's a minimum of the negative likelihood because it's easier in such way. So the problem I will try to minimize is a problem where I try to find the minimum of a function, which is a sum of two terms. So one function, L of theta, which is defined by this integral. Okay, so it's an integral of a product with respect to phi of u, and this product it's an exponential of a sum. So n also can be very large. Okay, theta is very large, so it's already a strange something which is rather difficult to compute. So it's more or less, it's not easy to compute this quantity. So you are trying to minimize the function, and this function already is not easy to compute. But this is typically a smooth function, okay? And you add to this function a penalty, which is this. Typically, we will discuss this penalty later on. So this penalty is a penalty where you have, which is convex. It's convex, but it can be non-smooth. It's important to have, if you want to have a penalty which is promoting sparsity, which is important when you are doing when you do statistics in large dimension. So you need to work with penalty which are non-smooth. Okay, so it seems to be a tough problem, but it's not a simple problem. It's a tough problem. The last thing I need to observe is the fact that I have a way to compute the gradient, which is okay a bit. It's less. It seems to be less. It's easier, in fact, to compute the. It's reasonably easy to compute the gradient of the log likelihood. So when you compute the gradient, I will not do all the detailed calculation, but when you compute the gradient of the log likelihood, what you have to compute, in fact, is the following integral. So you have to compute the gradient of the complete data likelihood, which is this function, okay? And you have to integrate the gradient of the complete data likelihood with respect to the posterior distribution of the random effect given the observation. And the posterior distribution of the random effect given the observation is defined like this. So it's a product of the prior distribution of the random effect, okay, which is multiplied by the likelihood of the random effect given theta, and which is divided by L of theta, which is here the complete data likelihood. So basically, you will have to compute a quantity like this, which is an integral of this sum, okay, with respect to distribution, which is the distribution, the posterior distribution of the random effect given the observations. Okay, so if I want to summarize what I need to do, what I need to do, I have to compute the minimum of a function, okay, L of theta, which is intractable, okay, which is defined by an expectation. I know how to compute the gradient of this function, but the gradient of this function will be defined as a conditional expectation of the gradient of the complete data likelihood with respect to the posterior distribution of the random effect given the observations. Okay. What I can prove also in this model is that the gradient is Lipschitz. It plays a role in what I said next. It's not necessarily convex. There are in some cases the problem is convex, in some cases it's not. Okay, and what is the other constraint is that I add to this function, I add a function g theta. G theta will be a proper convex function, so it means it's a convex function which is not infinite everywhere. So it's a proper in such sense. This function is assumed to be lower semi-continuous. So it's the epigraph of this function will assume to be closed, but I will assume that this function is not differentiable. And my problem would be to what I want to solve today is to solve this type of problem. And there are many other issues, and in particular, there are things which are of interest. For example, like proving consistency of the parameter theta, estimating the rank of the estimating the factor loadings or the dimension of the factor loading. So there are many other statistical problems that might be raised by this type of models, which are rather popular, in fact, for example, in biostatistics, and they become popular also in machine learning, but which are, of course, much less studied than the classical logistic regression or linear regression problem. As we discussed this morning with Sasha Goldenschluger, it's like, the statistician prefer to work with very simple models. So if you look at the bulk of theoretical statistics, so you spend a lot of time on linear regression model where you can prove everything, under very various assumptions, and you go into the detail. But as soon as you go outside say the linear regression and logistic regression, but without random effects, there are no much results available because, of course, the results are rather difficult to obtain in such case. And even, in fact, implementing, and I will more discuss the computational issue problem here, implementing an algorithm which might work in this scenario with a large number of data and high-dimensional parameters is already a challenge. And this is more the challenge I will address today in this talk. Okay, so what is the wrap-up? So I minimize a composite function. It's f of theta, g theta. The function f and the gradient of f are intractable, but they might be computed as a conditional expectation of the complete data log likelihood. G is closed and convex, but not smooth. And I will assume that the gradient here is Lipschitz. Okay, so I will just to, before going to the solution, I will just discuss how you solve this type of problem, provided the fact that you are able to compute the function f of theta. So I will first look at the case where you know how to compute f of theta. And there is an algorithm which has been proposed quite recently, say 20 years ago, which is, it has a long history. It's called, it's a kind of, it might be interpreted as a kind of mirror descent. So it has some roots come from the work by Nemirovsky. So this algorithm has several phases, so it depends upon the audience on which you are talking at. But I will describe the algorithm. So but it's not at all our algorithm. So it's an algorithm which is there for about 20 years, and our results are more in this area. Okay. So these algorithms are all based on the definition of what is called the proximal map. So what is a proximal map for a function g? So assume that g is a closed convex function. And if I take a regularization parameter gamma, what is a proximal map for the function g and regularization parameter gamma is defined as follows. So you solve, in fact, a minimization problem. So you solve, so assuming that theta is, I should have said that theta is convex also, of course. What you solve typically is this, you solve this minimization problem, where g is a convex function, theta is convex, rho minus theta square, of course, is convex. So it's a combination of two convex functions. So it remains with positive weight, so it remains convex. So which means that this, and because rho minus theta is strictly convex, it means that this minimization problem, provided that theta is convex itself, this minimization problem has a solution, and this solution is a unique solution. And this unique solution is called the proximal operator, is a proximal operator associated to the function g and the smoothing parameter gamma. So typically people, in general, people index proximal with gamma and g because the proximal is proximal associated to the function. But since we will apply the proximal only to the function g, I did not indicate that gamma is a function of g. So it's implicit in my notation. So the uniqueness of the proximal operator comes from the fact that the function g is convex, and you add to this function g a strongly convex function, so which means that the sum of the two it becomes strongly convex and therefore has a minimum. And in fact, if you take as a function g the convex indicator of a convex set, so a function I of k, which is equal to k being a convex set, the function which is equal to 0 when you are inside k and which is equal to infinity when you are outside the convex set k, then the proximal operator is simply the projection onto k, so which means that the proximal might be seen as a kind of generalization of the projection. So the proximal operator is exactly equal to the projection when g is the convex indicator of a convex set. Okay, and this is why, in fact, the proximal operator inherits from the projector its properties. So basically, you have the proximal operator have properties which are difficult to say whether it's a proximal operator which inherits the property of the projector, which inherits the property of the proximal. But in fact, you might think as the proximal as property which are really closely related to projection onto convex sets. Okay, so something also that we will use very often is the fact that if you assume that you may say, okay, that's it's a bit weird to it's not perhaps very easy to compute the minimum such minimization problem, but in fact, in somehow it might be easy in some cases. It is very easy, for example, in cases where the function g is the sum of function which acts on each individual component of the vector theta, which is, if you remember well, what is g in my problem? G in my problem is the elastic net penalty. So in elastic net penalty would be exactly the case. Okay, so for elastic net it would be the case because that would be the sum of the squares. This will be the sum of the absolute value. So which means in that case that the function g is a sum of coordinates. And with the definition of the proximal operator, it's easy to see that when you want to compute the proximal operator associated to this function g, provided that this function g acts on groups of parameters, so the proximal operator for the parameter theta is simply equal to the parameter for the function g1 appearing in this sum. Okay, so for example, if theta 1, theta 2, theta p are scalar variables, it means that you have to solve, instead of to solve this problem, you have to solve scalar problem, which is quite can be quite easy. And of course, that the proof of this is completely trivial. Of course, there are so we don't do much math today, but in fact, there is a nice characterization of the proximal operator. This nice characterization is given here. So if G is a convex function and the proximal operator of gamma G at theta, P is a proximal is a prox of G at the point theta. If and only if, in fact, you have this property, which is a bit weird looking, but in fact, it's not very difficult to see why it works like that. So it's a two-line proof. So I don't hesitate to do two-line proof. So what you know is that GP is defined as a minimum of a function. So it means GP P is what is the proximal? The proximal, you minimize this quantity. Okay, so if you minimize this quantity, you can write the minimum is GP plus 1 over 2 gamma P minus theta square, okay, is less than G of alpha rho plus 1 minus alpha P, okay? And then you use the fact, because theta is assumed to be convex, so alpha rho plus 1 minus alpha P belongs to the set theta, okay? And what you will do, of course, you will take the limit when alpha goes to 0 of this quantity, and taking the limit of alpha when alpha goes to 0 of this quantity, you end up with this characterization of the proximal operator. And of course, you might obtain this result directly by simply saying that G being, by using the characterization of a minimum of a convex function in terms of its subdifferential. You know what is a subdifferential? And so when you look at this characterization, it's in such case you see that we have simply written here. You simply write this condition, which is a characterization for P being the minimum of this convex function. Okay, so you obtain these characterizations, and we will look often. Of course, in the case where so with this formula, in fact, you can compute a lot of you have a variational characterization of the proximal operator, and from this variational characterization of the proximal operator, you can compute the prox operator of many functions. So, for example, you can compute if G theta is quadratic form. Of course, the proximal operator is given by this. So it's simply in that case because G in that case is differentiable. So you simply solve the subdifferential in that case is equal to is a single point, which is the gradient of the function g. So in this case, this inclusion, this relation is simply an identity, so you can compute the proximal operator, which is a kind of, in that case, the shrinkage of the parameter theta. Using the same characterization, you can compute the proximal operator for the norm. So it's not a one norm here. It's the norm, the square root of the norm. So it's used in some cases, but I will not use that today. And I am more interested even in the case where the proximal operator is a lasso type penalty. So in the lasso type penalty, what you will do is that typically you will take the L1, the absolute value of parameter theta I, multiply by some positive weight lambda I. Then in such case, in this case, the parameter, in this case, g theta is a sum of one-dimensional random variables, so which means that you have to solve, to compute the proximal operator, you use the first rule, which says that the proximal operator in such case is the proximal associated to each individual component. So in which case you, it's completely explicit, and you obtain exactly, in such case, you obtain exactly what is called the soft thresholding rule. Okay, so which means that what is the proximal operator associated to this function, but what you will do typically is that when you are at a parameter theta, you just, if you are, if theta is larger than gamma lambda I, you take it's theta I minus gamma lambda I, okay? If you are, is the absolute value of theta I is less than gamma lambda I, you take it to 0, so you push it to 0. And if it's theta I is less than minus gamma lambda I, you take theta I plus gamma lambda I. So it's a soft thresholding, so which means that what you will do when you apply the proximal operator is that you will put to 0 all the value which belongs to some interval which is of length gamma lambda I, and then you reduce, you shrink a little bit, you shrink the value which are outside this interval. Okay, and you can do the same. If you look, instead of looking at the lasso type penalty, if you look at the elastic net penalty, you do basically the same, and you add shrinkage, an additional shrinkage on the parameter. Okay, to understand a little bit more what we do with proximal operator, so there is a first, when you want to minimize the function, there is a first thing that can be done is simply to iterate the proximal operator. And this is basically what we do if f is, if you have simply the function g, what we do, okay, and I will just show you later on what we will do when f is not constant. So imagine for the time being that f is constant. So what we will do is that you will iterate the prox operator. So you start from some point and you iterate the proximal operator. And what we will show here is that the fixed point of the proximal operator are coincide with the minimum of the function g. Okay. But to see that, we simply use the variational characterization of the proximal operator, which is given there. Okay. And I simply, if I want to characterize the minimum, so if it's a fixed point of the proximal operator, then it means that theta is a point which satisfies this relation. So theta should be equal to the prox of gamma g of the parameter theta. Okay? So if I just substitute theta in this expression, so p is equal to theta, because p is equal to theta here, so I have g theta, okay, plus, so rho is some arbitrary point, minus p, which becomes theta. Here I write theta minus theta, okay, so this term cancels, of course. So I have g of theta there, which is less than g of rho, and this is true for all rho in theta. So which means that the fixed point of the prox is coincide with the minimum of the function g. Another property which is of interest, I will perhaps go a little bit faster. The second point which is of interest is to see that the proximal operator is non-expansive, which means in particular that it's a more than non-expansive. So in particular, it means, if you look at this expression, it means in particular that the proximal operator is Lipschitz itself. Okay, it's Lipschitz in the sense that if you take so if you control, you have this. So it's more than Lipschitz. But if you just compute the absolute value of this and you take as a upper bound p minus q, it means that the proximal operator of theta minus at theta minus the proximal operator at rho is less than theta minus rho. So the proximal operator is a contraction exactly like a projection. And in fact, this is also something for a projection. This is also, of course, true. Huh? So it's co-coercive in such sets. And you obtain this expression very easily simply by looking at the variational characterization of the proximal operator at two different points, which are P and Q. Okay, so now you know everything on the proximal operator. 5 minutes. I don't take my. I start at what time? I start at half an hour. Okay.
You have half an hour.
Okay. Okay. So I will take my. My students always complain that I speak too much. Huh? So stop me. Okay. So what I will analyze this algorithm, which is called the proximal gradient algorithm, which is sometimes, in some cases, it's called the E-star algorithm. So it has many names. It's mirror prox, or it depends upon what you are, the way you are speaking about this algorithm and with whom. But this algorithm is very simple. When you have to minimize a function which is minus L plus g of theta, what you are doing is that so you apply first a gradient. So if f is equal to minus L, so it would be theta n minus gamma n plus 1 times the gradient of the function f, evaluated at theta, okay? And then you apply the proximal operator for the function g. So basically you alternate between two things. So for the smooth part of the function, which is f, you apply a gradient step, okay? And for the function the function g, which is not differentiable, which is the penalty term like in the lasso, what you apply the proximal operator. Okay, so it's and you alternate between gradient step and proximal step. So this is for example in the case where you do lasso type penalty. You obtain an algorithm which is called in image processing the E-star algorithm. So it's called iterative soft shrinkage algorithm, because what you do at each iteration, you apply a gradient step, and then you apply the soft, because the proximal step for the L1 norm is a soft shrinkage operator. So you apply a soft shrinkage to the result of the gradient step, and you iterate this algorithm like that. Okay. So in image processing, for example, it's an algorithm which is very, very popular. So there are fast versions of this, but it's very popular in image processing and in statistics in general. So if you want to understand a bit more how it works, it's interesting, and we need to do that a bit to understand the property of the perturbed proximal operator. What we will need to do is that we will need to understand a bit what is which is a very general principle for optimization, which is a majorization minorization framework. So it's called sometimes the MM framework. So what is the majorization minorization framework? The idea is to compute what is called a surrogate function. So what is a surrogate function? So f of rho is this function. When the surrogate function should be a function which is easy to, so it's a function that you will, at each point theta, okay, you will define a function gamma, q, excuse me, which should be easy to optimize. So it's the first criterion that should be easy to optimize, and we should satisfy this property. So its graph should be always above the graph of the function f that you are willing to minimize. So you should have for all rho, f of rho should be smaller than q gamma of rho of theta. So which means that you want to minimize f of rho, and you construct a surrogate, and this surrogate should be always larger than the function f. Okay, and it should be equal to the function f at the point theta. So if you look at this, it means that this is a function I want to minimize, and I construct at each point, I construct a surrogate, okay? I construct a surrogate, and so the surrogate function is always above the graph of the function f, and what I will do at each iteration, once I have a surrogate, what I will do at each iteration I will simply, sorry. Okay, at each iteration, what I will do, I will simply minimize this function. So this is why it's called a minorization. It's a majorization minimization interpretation in the sense that what I do, at each iteration I determine a function which is a surrogate function which is always larger than the function that I am willing to minimize, okay? And then what I do, I minimize this function, okay? So it's a very general principle. It's a very well known and used in statistics. In particular, it's a basis of one of the most popular algorithms in statistics which is called the EM algorithm. And here it's another instantiation of the MM algorithm, which is maximization and minorization algorithm with surrogate function. And the surrogate function that you are constructing is simply given by this, okay? It's simply given by this. So you take the function f. Okay, you keep the function rho, okay, and I take the function f at the point theta, and you do a quadratic expansion of the function f around theta. So it's around theta. The first term in the expansion is f of theta. Then you have a gradient term. It's gradient of f of theta rho minus theta, and then you have a quadratic term. And the quadratic term you simply you simply replace it by its maximum value, and its maximum value is the maximum value of the Hessian, if you wish, is majorized by 1 over 2 gamma, because L, I assume that I have a gradient Lipschitz function, which means basically that my gradient being Lipschitz, it means that the quadratic term cannot be larger than this one. Okay? This is why it's important to have a gradient Lipschitz function in this case. So doing this, so I use a quadratic expansion for the function f at each point theta. I keep g of rho, and doing this, I obtain a surrogate function which is given by this and which satisfies these two properties. And now what I will do, I take this surrogate function and I will maximize the surrogate function. So to maximize the surrogate function, it's defined like this. It's simply algebraic rewriting. So if I rewrite this expression, I obtain this. Okay. And what I see here is that when I want to minimize the surrogate function, okay, so this term does not depend on rho. So I fix theta, I optimize this function with respect to rho, and what I obtain is this term does not depend upon theta, and I exactly obtain the following stuff, which means that the minimum of rho of this function, of the surrogate function, is exactly equal to the proximal of the gradient of theta minus gamma delta f of theta. So which means that doing this, I obtain, it's really a majorization minimization interpretation in the sense that I have at each time step, I construct a surrogate function and I minimize the surrogate function, and proximal gradient is really doing this. So what you do is that you are theta n, you construct the surrogate function, you are minimizing, then you reconstruct the surrogate, you are minimizing the surrogate, and you end up to the end. Okay, so of course the stochastic gradient, the classical gradient algorithm, there is nothing stochastic there, is the class in the case where g of theta, of course the gradient algorithm there is nothing stochastic at the time. The gradient algorithm belongs to this class. If g of theta is a convex set, then the algorithm is simply the projected gradient algorithm is also a proximal gradient step. And as I said already, when you apply this with an elastic net penalty, what you will do typically is that you will apply at each iteration of the gradient, you apply an operator which mixed a soft thresholding operator plus shrinkage. And if you apply this, you will obtain a minimum. So what is when you do the analysis of this? So in fact, if I take this assumption, so I assume that theta is a finite dimensional Euclidean space. You can. I'm not interested in this type of stuff, but of course this can be extended to more general settings. So you can. This type of algorithm can be analyzed in infinite dimension also, but I'm not interested in that. What are the assumptions that we do all the time? So theta is a finite dimensional Euclidean space. G is a closed convex function. I assume that f is continuously differentiable, that the gradient of s is gradient Lipschitz, which is important to construct a surrogate function, so which satisfies this. And what you can prove is that in this case, the proximal gradient algorithm is converging to the set of the stationary point of this function, which is delta f of theta plus gradient plus the subgradient of g of theta. So of course, if f is convex, these are the global minimizer of the function big F. Big F is the sum of f of theta. Of course, if the function f is not convex, of course you cannot you don't have you converge only to local. So it's a characterization of the local minima of this function. It's not much on this. Okay, so and basically there is no big surprise here to see that if you are looking at what are the minimum of this function, you look at the minimum. So to look at the minimum, assuming that the function f is subdifferential, it means that 0 belongs to the subdifferential of gamma f of theta. So in that case, 0 belongs to gamma, the gradient of f of theta plus the subdifferential of gamma of g of theta. And you obtain by just adding theta in the both direction, you obtain this characterization. And you will see that it's exactly the characterization of the proximal operator. So you end up with this relation. Okay. It's also there are many missing that you can if you start to look at the details. So you are many things that you can prove also that the function f, of course, is the Lyapunov function for the mapping T gamma. So which means that each iteration of the algorithm, the function f, which is the sum of f plus g, decrease along the iteration of the algorithm. So it's a monotonically convergent algorithm. And you have what you can prove is that you, in general, you will. The thing which is easy to prove is that you f of theta n, even without any convexity assumption on f, converges to the stationary point, and that theta n plus 1 minus theta n goes to 0. Okay. And in the convex case, in fact, so if the function f is convex, you might even have rate of convergence, and you might prove that you have rate of convergence which are like 1 over n. And you can prove, and it's a theory by Yuri Nesterov, that this rate of convergence cannot be improved under this type of assumption. So with 1 over n, you cannot do better than that. And I don't discuss this point. You can also obtain rate of convergence to how fast you go, even when the function f is not convex. You might ask how fast you go to the local minima, and you can also prove that this algorithm is rate optimal under this type of assumption. You cannot improve the rate of convergence to local minima when you are not convex. Okay. Okay. So what is a wrap up? So if I want to minimize this, f of theta n, so the iterate of the proximal gradient is non-increasing, and therefore converge. If the function f is convex, that the weight it decreases to f of f star is big O of 1 over n, where n is the number of iteration. And under some mild additional assumption, you might also prove in some case that theta n converges to theta star when theta star is a minimizer of f. Okay, that's a wrap up. So now I will discuss the perturbed proximal gradient algorithm. So in a perturbed proximal gradient algorithm, so what I have analyzed is exact algorithm. So the exact algorithm which looks like this, and the perturb gradient algorithm, what I will do is that I replace, in fact, the gradient by a quantity which is a proxy for minus the gradient of f of theta n. Okay, so L equal minus of f. Okay, and what I will try to, what is the problem? So I need to find sufficient condition on the perturbation in order to preserve the convergence of this algorithm. So what kind of assumption should I do? Of course, the first thing I should look at is the fact that because I replace the gradient by an approximation, the perturbation of the gradient, I lose the monotonic decreasing property, so the function f is no longer monotonically decreasing. But nevertheless, it might be, we might have results because we know that in the case where we have the perturbed, when you have a dynamical system which is perturbed, when the perturbation asymptotically vanish, then you might, especially for system where you have a Lyapunov function, so where the convergence is stable in this sense with the Lyapunov function, you can prove that even with the perturbation, you might converge. Okay, so what are the type of results that we can obtain in such case? So in general, so if you assume that the perturbation goes to 0, okay, and if you assume that the parameter theta n are bounded, so it's difficult, in fact, to guarantee with this type of algorithm. So it's a separate problem to guarantee the stability of the iterates. What you can prove is that the function f of theta n, okay, converge to a connected component of f of L, where L are the stationary point of the algorithm. And if the interior of f of L is empty, then there exists an f theta star, which is such that the limit of f theta n converge to f theta star. So, which means that provided that the perturbation vanish, okay, you might still find, you might still obtain the convergence of f of theta n, where theta n is obtained not with the exact algorithm, with the perturbed algorithm. So it means that the thing which is important to understand here is that this algorithm converges, but if I replace the gradient of f by an approximation, provided that this approximation, so put here a gradient of f, provided that this approximation goes to 0, okay, then the algorithm will still continue to converge to the minimum of the function big F. Okay, so what I will skip this part, I think. So you can do better. So you can obtain more precise results because these results are not super precise, of course, when you are not convex. So we have developed results in the non-convex case. That's a more recent work that I'm currently doing with Blazej Maciejewski and Simon Masiewicz from Poland. So we are working at to try to extend this type of result for f which are non-convex, but which I will present here is some results that you can obtain when you assume, in addition, that f is convex. So small f is convex. So you have now what you are looking at is you have the function f is convex and g is convex. So the two functions are convex. And in such case, I will skip to the result. What you obtain is something like this. Okay, that you obtain is something like this. So you have what I call the basic inequalities that you are, okay. It's there is a bit of work to obtain this basic inequality, but the basic inequality tells you what? It tells you that you have an exact expression, in fact, of the way the iterate behaves. So theta star is a point which is realizing the minimum. So it's any minimizer. So it's theta star does not need to be unique. It's so theta star is one possible minimum of the function theta, f. Okay, and I have this relation which relates theta n plus 1 minus theta star. Okay, with respect to two things. So theta n minus theta star minus 2 times gamma n plus 1 f theta n minus theta f star. So it's funny because you have the two quantity which appear. So you have a quantity, you have both theta n minus theta star and f theta n minus theta star which appear. And you have two quantities which are which depends upon the perturbation. So eta n plus 1 is a difference between the true gradient and the perturbed version of the gradient. So it's completely explicit in this case. So it's a bit different when you are in a non-convex case. You don't have its characterization. It's a bit it's more difficult in the non-convex case. But in the convex case, you have a very beautiful inequality. So it's the way the perturbation manifests in this thing is completely explicit. And from that, you can do a lot of things. You can first prove the convergence of. So to obtain that, it's in the slide. It's a three-point lemma. So there are many different proofs. So there are many different proofs. So the three-point lemma is a proof which has been given by Beck and Teboul, and there are another proof which has been given by Nemirovsky and Anatoly Yuditsky, which is based on another type of technique. So basically, it's if you look at the details, so they are not so different, but it's different. The proof is not exactly the same, but it basically you use this type of result from Beck and Teboul. They did not use that for exactly the same in the same setting, but basically we follow their idea to analyze the algorithm. Okay. So the first thing is that you might first prove the convergence of the parameter theta n. So what you do is that you will sum. You have a difference here, so you can iterate this inequality, and if you iterate this inequality, you obtain something like this. Okay, and provided that you can control these two sum. Okay, so this is the sum of the increments, for example, can be seen to control. Can be shown to converge when n goes to infinity. Then you will prove the convergence of theta n plus 1 to theta star. Okay, and what you do simply is that you simply add this expression, and you just notice that f theta n minus f star are positive. Okay, so that gives you a first convergence result. Okay, and you have a second convergence result. So that's the convergence result for the parameters, and you have a convergence result for the function itself. And for the function itself, sometimes it's better to use, instead of looking at the convergence of theta k, sometimes it's better to look at the convergence of a convex combination of theta k. So you do some kind of averaging with weights. So ak are weights that you can try to optimize. So there are different possible choices. You may take, for example, if you take ak equal 1, you obtain a simple averaging, but you can also take some authors prefer to take ak equal to gamma k, okay, in which case this term we cancel, but it's not. And there are other choices which are possible, and you obtain for for the estimator, which is obtained by taking the iterate theta k and weighting them with the weights ak. You obtain an exact expression. There is nothing. It's completely non-asymptotic. You have an exact expression of the error, the deviation from the function f, which is convex in such case, evaluated at the smooth point, which is ak theta k divided by an. Okay, it's completely controlled by a quantity like that. Okay, and now if you add a probability assumption on eta k and eta k square, okay, you may obtain results like rates of convergence in expectation or large probability bounds, depending upon the type of assumption you are ready to do on the perturbation eta k. Okay?
I'm sorry, what is big T? Big T at point theta k? I mean this, yeah.
This one, T gamma is a mapping. So it's we go fast. T gamma is a overall mapping. So T gamma is a mapping. So it's a combination. T gamma applied to theta, okay, is a proximal mapping.
For right gradient.
Yeah, for the right gradient. Okay.
And the theta k plus 1 is the same, but for
well, yeah, theta k plus 1 is a perturb. So in that case, theta k plus 1 is theta k plus 1 is given by that, okay? And T gamma is exactly, T gamma is the way you propagate theta k if you apply the right, the true mapping.
Okay.
That's it, yeah. Okay, so what we'll do now, 5 minutes, no, or 10 minutes perhaps, 5?
10 minutes.
10 minutes, okay. So how we do that? So now what type of? So now we have this result on the perturb proximal gradient. So we can, as I said, with this formula you can do a lot of things. You can compute the expectation of errors. You can compute large deviation. You have convergence bound with large probability. And what we have analyzed is what we call the Monte Carlo proximal gradient algorithm. Remember what we need to do in our setting is that we need the gradient of the likelihood function, as I explained earlier, is obtained as conditional expectation of some function h of theta x, with pi of theta being the posterior distribution of the random effects given the current value of the parameter and the observation. Okay. So what I need to compute, in fact, is a gradient, but this time I need to compute a gradient which is defined as an expectation of a function with respect to a low distribution pi, which itself depends upon the parameter theta, and which makes the difference with earlier application of stochastic proximal gradient algorithms. As, for example, there have been an analysis of this type of algorithm, but with function with where the function h of theta x is integrated with respect to a fixed distribution pi. Here, the distribution pi also depends upon the parameter theta. So to do this, in fact, you have to integrate. In our case, the random effects. So it all depends upon the size of the random effects. So in some cases, which are sometimes interesting. So when the random effect is in small dimensions, so which happen in some cases, then you can do simple numerical integration. So there is nothing random there, but it's okay only when the dimension is small. Say, for example, less than 5, I would say. Then you can really use, in that case, non Monte Carlo techniques like cubature or quasi-Monte Carlo methods, and so we will not analyze this here. The other option is to use importance sampling estimator, but importance sampling estimator works, but they are not very efficient when the dimension of the random effect is large. And what we have done is that we have typically used an MCMC algorithm with a stationary distribution, so pi of theta, in order to approximate our gradient. So our algorithm is an algorithm which mixes an optimization step and a Monte Carlo step, and we perform the Monte Carlo step using a Markov chain Monte Carlo algorithm, because we are with a target as a target distribution. We use the stationary distribution of the Markov chain, which is a posterior distribution of the random effect given for the current value of the parameter and given the data. So typically, we will discuss a lot. The Markov chain Monte Carlo tomorrow, if you are there. So, what typically, so there are two problems to handle. So first, you have when you do Markov chain Monte Carlo, even if you use an algorithm which, so what you do typically is that you will run a Markov chain, and this Markov chain has a stationary distribution which is equal to pi theta. Okay, so there are techniques to do that, and I know that Denis Belomesti, they introduce you to the world of MCMC. So you have two problems when you want to apply this type of algorithm. First, you need to know that the conditional expectation of hn plus 1, which is this, is not exactly equal to the gradient of L of theta n. So you have a bias term. So and you have to control the amount of bias, and also you have a fluctuation term which is given by that. Okay, so there is you have to control the you have to control two things. You have to control the bias of the gradient, and you have to control also the fluctuation of the gradient. And you have to do this. You use mini batches. So at each iteration, you will perform a mini batch. So you will take you will run a mini batch of an MCMC algorithm. So then, so you using this, you can that we not discuss everything, but you might there is an interplay between three things. So the step size. So you can use different type of step size, decreasing step size or constant step size. You have the size of the mini batch, okay, which is m of n. What is the number of iteration? What is the number of iteration in the Markov chain that you perform at each iteration? And there is also an, which is an is a parameter that you use in order to smooth, to average your estimate. And so when you combine everything, you obtain in fact the best the rate. And I think the best one is 1 over n, which is obtained with b. So you increase b. So you should use fixed step size. I don't remember exactly. Huh? Okay. So you have a fixed step size. So a fixed step size. So gamma should be equal to. There should be. Well, it depends if you have bias or not. So it's a bit more complicated. But normally it's a fixed step size. You use an should be increasing. So typically you use an increasing an, but you can use any a is okay. And for the size of the batch, you take b equal 1. So you increase the size of the batch should be increased linearly. And in such case, the rate of convergence will be 1 over n. Okay. A rate which is evaluated as a number of simulation. And to reach precision, the number of iteration, the number of simulation which should be performed to reach a precision delta is 1 over delta square. So if you want to have a precision which is 1 over delta, you need delta square simulation. Okay, you can, I will not discuss this, but you can consider acceleration of this algorithm, which is called, there is a schemes which have been proposed by Nesterov and to accelerate the proximal algorithm. So it does not mix very well with stochastic approximation, so I will not discuss this, but we have an underlying, we have a work on this type of stuff in order to understand what you can do with Nesterov relaxation in the stochastic context. So, and we argue that you should use in the stochastic context, if you want to speed up the algorithm, you should use different over-relaxation techniques. So I will not discuss this point. And finally, I will discuss briefly the results that we have obtained. So remember, so what I'm willing to optimize is this quantity. So that's my original problem, which was to optimize the logistic regression with random effect. So I have to optimize this. The function h of theta is given by that. So in such case, I have the way to sample this algorithm is it's not completely straightforward, but we use a technique which is based on data augmentation technique. So I will not discuss this a lot, but there is a good technique which is based on what is called polygamma density. So it's based on what is called a data augmentation approach. So instead of computing this quantity, you extend the state space of the Markov chain by W, and you use a kind of Gibbs step. So it's an algorithm which has been inspired by an algorithm which has been proposed to Paulson in a different context, and which is written there. So it's a pretty efficient way to sample these quantities. And I will just look at a case where you have here. So it's a toy example. I will not discuss a real example because they are more complicated. But we have 1,000 regressors. We have 500 observations. We have a correlated design. So out of this 1,000 regressors, we have 20 regressors which are active. We have a random effect which is of size 5, okay, and that's the factor loading. So factor loading is diagonal. So in fact, you have so you have 500 observations. When it is black, it means that you have no it's 0, and white is you have 1. So which means that you have in fact it's a diagonal factor loading. It means typically that you have different random effects. So typically, what does it mean? It means that you have, imagine that you have a clustered population. Here the size of cluster are exactly 100. And for each subpopulation has one random effect, okay? So it's a model, of course. I'm sure that Valodia will not be okay with this. And so what we have shown here is that with assuming that you have Mn which is our best setting, so which grow linearly with n, is with 150 iterations, and this is so we are just reconstructing here the estimated beta and the true beta. It's not that bad, especially because we have a correlated design, so you can compute the sensitivity and the precision. So we see that our algorithm performed quite well in terms of sensitivity and precision, so it's quite rather good. And so the averaging also is very averaging is it's useful. So there are a lot of results. I don't have time to discuss all these results, but it's important to discuss the interplay between the size of the mini batch, the averaging, the way you decrease gamma n. So we have written there is a paper which has been published in GMLR last year, which we have put a lot of simulation in order to just explain what we have done in this area. Okay, and so what is a take-home message? So there is a very efficient, it's an efficient and globally converging. It's globally converging when you are in convex case. So we have also results which hold for in the non-convex setting with rates. Also, I did not display the rates in this presentation. For penalized likelihood in incomplete data models, so in models where you have, for example, mixed effect model, but there are many incomplete data models. For example, as soon as you have missing data, you are an incomplete data model with convex sparsity inducing penalty, okay, provided that computing the proximum operator is not too difficult. We have proposed algorithm which combine Monte Carlo step, Markov chain Monte Carlo step with mini batches, averaging, and constant or decreasing step size, and which works quite well. And then it remains to thank you for your attention, and I'm waiting for questions. Thanks a lot. Thanks.
Well, am I right that you are doing this integration out of this nuisance parameter just because the dimension is huge? So in principle, there are few these parameters and the sample size sufficiently large, you can just do regression on the full parameter space, including both the target parameters and these nuisance parameters, and then just forget about nuisance.
It's not true, but.
Because
no, you have
random and have some distribution.
Yeah, you have some distribution. Yes, that's it. It's not nuisance in the sense that you have to. It's not a nuisance. It's a nuisance parameter. So the size is. It depends upon the type of. It's really the thing which is important here. When you put random effects in this type of regression, it's important in particular to because what people have noticed when you do logistic regression typically. What people have noticed is that in general, the predictions that you obtain with logistic regression does not reflect the uncertainties that you have on your prediction. Okay, so when you add random effects, of course you add a degree of freedom, in the sense that because you have a random effect. So of course you don't put random effects for each individuals, but you typically put random effects for groups of individuals. Okay, in which case for example, in fact, the motivation of this work, I did not speak about that because it's a whole presentation to discuss these results. It's on genome-wide association study. So what you do in genome-wide association studies, so you have, so then the number of observation is not very large, so it's of order of thousands, typically, individuals. The dimension is very large because it's gene expression data, okay? And what people have noticed when people in biology have noticed when they look at logistic regression is that logistic regression is of course predict and why is will you develop some kind of cancer or not? Okay, so it's a trait. And what people have noticed is that if you don't put random effects, then you typically have you are overconfident in your prediction. Okay, so you miss in fact a fluctuation in your prediction that you will obtain putting some random effects. Okay, well then of course it's discussing what is the right size of random effect. So what people do, what you typically do in mixed effect regression is that you typically have also to estimate. So you assume that the random effect has a certain covariance, a certain structure. And of course, what you should do in this type of modeling, you should also estimate the covariance typically of the random effect. Here the covariance is, I have assumed here, because I assumed that, I didn't want to speak about that, but I have assumed that I have what is called the factor loading. So both the size, the dimension of the random effect and the factor loading is known, but what you typically do when you do mixed effect regression is that you also estimate these factor loadings. Okay, so it's a two steps fitting problem.
Question here.
Yeah, is it possible to use second order optimization scheme like Newton method instead of gradient descent with Markov chain Monte Carlo?
Yes, in fact you can. You can, yes. Of course, the thing which would be difficult in such case is that you, in the case where you use first order method, you only have to approximate the gradient. So you simply have to, but most probably you could approximate. There are formula to approximate because we use a Fisher formula. So if you remember well, we use a Fisher formula for. In this type of setting, we use a Fisher formula for, okay, where is this? We use a Fisher formula to compute the gradient to obtain, and you have a corresponding formula for the Hessian. So the Hessian is also, so if you look at the Hessian of the incomplete data likelihood, there are several formulas. So the simplest one is called the Lewis formula, where you may express the Hessian of the incomplete data likelihood as a covariance, in fact, of this quantity with respect to the same posterior distribution. So it's doable to compute the Hessian of the incomplete data likelihood. Okay, with the same, and typically you can do that with the same sample. So with the same sample, you can estimate both the gradient. And I never did that, but you can do. Basically, you can.
Is it the case that we need to use much larger batch size to take a proper?
I would say I never tried it, but I would say so, because I'm afraid that it's even more complex to compute the Hessian than to compute the gradient. So I would say so, but I never tried it. I never tried. Yeah, they should have done that, but I never tried it. Yeah.
Question I already asked. So you need to know the dimension of or number of your element vectors, and very similar in economics. It's instruments. It's always equation. What is the instrument? How many instruments? Too few or too many?
That's a problem.
Yeah, and so what people are doing. Just try with different.
That's a bit in biology. It's a bit like this. Yeah, what they in general what they do in the JWEAS, in the genome-wide association study, for example, what they do clustering of users depending upon, for example, because it believes that they have. For example, when you do a genome-wide association study, You have proteomics data, so you have gene expression data, and at the same time you have other information, like for example you have been exposed to, you are living in a city, or you have been exposed to. With this type of clustering, you more or less start with you have a bit an idea of how many clusters you have in a population. But otherwise, what you do typically is that you are willing to estimate, of course, the dimension of the. That would be perfect to be able to estimate both the dimension of the random effect and also the covariance of the factor loading. But at the same time, it's much better. So adding random effects improves a lot already the prediction compared to fixed effects. So of course it's not completely justified statistically speaking, but it works much better. But I agree, it's random effects is problems they have in econometrics. There is the same type of problems in econometrics.
Any more questions? If not, then let us speak this.
Thanks.